December 1944. A field headquarters somewhere in the Netherlands east of Arnhem. Field Marshal Walter Model is staring at a piece of paper. Not a battle map, not an order of battle, not an intelligence report on Allied tank formations or enemy supply lines. A weather forecast. Model is 53 years old. He was born in Gentin, a small town in the Prussian province of Saxony, the son of a music teacher. He is short, broad-shouldered, perpetually unshaven by the standards of the Wehrmacht's dress code. He wears a monocle that his staff have learned to read like a barometer. When it drops, something is about to go very wrong for someone in the room. He has been called Hitler's fireman, the man dispatched to every burning front to stop the collapse. He has served on the Eastern Front, in Army Group Center, in Army Group North Ukraine. He has never, in 30 years of soldiering, been accused of sentimentality. And yet, here he is, reading a weather forecast. Again, his aide, standing 3 feet away, will later describe the moment in terms that stay with you. Model did not curse. He did not throw the paper. He read it twice, set it down, and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he picked it up and read it a third time. The forecast called for clear skies. To understand why those 3 words, clear skies over the Netherlands in autumn, frightened Walter Model more than any armoured thrust, more than any airborne drop, more than the combined weight of 10 armoured brigades moving up a single road from the south, you have to go back to September. To a morning in September when Model was eating breakfast and the sky above him began to fill with aircraft, thousands of aircraft. And you have to understand something that has been almost entirely lost in the standard histories of what happened next. That the battle Model fought in the Netherlands in the autumn of 1944 was not primarily a battle against soldiers or tanks, it was a battle against the weather. Against the window of time the weather gave his enemies, against his own inability to predict when that window would open and when it would close. And the Americans, it turned out, were very good at predicting windows. Part 1. The fireman arrives. To understand what Model was doing in the Netherlands in September of 1944, you have to understand what the Wehrmacht looked like in the summer of that year. Not the Wehrmacht of 1941, the machine that had torn through France in 6 weeks and driven 700 miles into the Soviet Union in 5 months. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was something different. Something that looked like the same machine from a distance but was missing parts that didn't have replacements. By the end of August, Army Group B, the formation responsible for the defense of the Netherlands, Belgium and the approaches to Germany's western border, had lost roughly 300,000 men in the fighting in Normandy and the subsequent collapse. 300,000. The formations that had survived the breakout from the Falaise pocket were not divisions in any meaningful sense. Some of them were battle groups of a few hundred men, some were administrative remnants. The 84th Infantry Division, which had been one of the strongest formations in the West at the beginning of June, crossed the Seine with fewer than 1,000 soldiers and almost no artillery. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had fought with extraordinary ferocity in Normandy, arrived in Belgium with approximately 300 men and fewer than 40 tanks. This is the force that was supposed to hold the western frontier of Germany. Model arrived to take command of Army Group B on the 17th of August 1944. He had been sent by Hitler because the previous commander, Gunther von Kluge, was suspected of involvement in the July plot against Hitler's life. Von Kluge would die by his own hand 2 days later. Model inherited the ruins of an army and a front that was, in the technical military sense, not a front at all. It was a gap. A 300-mile gap through which the British and American armies were moving at a speed that had not been seen in European warfare since the Napoleonic campaigns. Model's response to this situation was characteristic. He did not request permission to withdraw to a prepared defensive line. He began improvising one. He pulled headquarters troops, signals units, Luftwaffe ground personnel, anti-aircraft crews and logistics soldiers out of their rear area billets and pushed them into the line. He scraped together every tank that could move under its own power. He sent personal orders to every formation he could reach, ordering them to hold their positions regardless of what was happening on their flanks. He was not trying to win, he was trying to buy time. Time for the German industrial machine to produce replacements, time for new divisions to be raised and trained, time for the natural friction of an overextended Allied supply line to slow the advance. He understood something that his opponents were beginning to understand too, though they would not fully accept it until much later. The Allied advance was not unlimited. It was running on fuel, on ammunition, on the physical endurance of men who had been fighting continuously since June the 6th. Every mile the Allied armies moved east was another mile of road that had to be kept open, another load of supplies that had to be trucked forward. The port of Cherbourg was operational, but it was at the end of a supply line that stretched across France. The port of Antwerp had been captured on the 4th of September, but the approaches to Antwerp, the Scheldt estuary, were still in German hands, which meant that Antwerp's enormous capacity was temporarily useless. Model knew this. He had spent the late summer calculating it. The Allied advance would slow. It had to slow. The question was whether he could hold long enough for it to happen. And then, on the morning of the 17th of September 1944, the sky above his headquarters near Oosterbeek began to fill with aircraft. Model was eating breakfast. The account is documented in the memoir of his aide-de-camp. The sound came first, a low, continuous thunder that grew until it was the only sound in the world. Model went to the window. Then he went outside. What he saw above him was the largest airborne armada in history. More than 1,500 aircraft and over 500 gliders, moving in columns that stretched from horizon to horizon. They were dropping men, tens of thousands of men, directly onto the map he had been studying all morning. He left his breakfast on the table. He left his headquarters. He was in his car within 4 minutes. Pause and think about that. The commander of Army Group B, the man responsible for the entire German defense of the Netherlands, was forced to abandon his own headquarters because paratroopers were landing on top of it. His headquarters was at the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek. The British 1st Airborne Division was landing in the fields within a mile of that hotel. Model evacuated with what he could carry and drove east to Bittwich's 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters at Doetinchem. This is where the story actually begins, not with the airborne landings, not with 10-10-10 Corps moving north from the Belgian border, with Model in a car driving east, understanding within the first 30 minutes of Operation Market Garden that something had gone very wrong for the Allies, and something had gone very right for him. Part 2. The mathematics of a corridor 62 miles long. The plan that Model was now trying to defeat had been conceived by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and approved by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower in the first week of September. Its formal name was Operation Market Garden. Its objective was to create a salient, a narrow corridor of Allied-held territory that would stretch approximately 62 miles northward through the Netherlands, crossing 4 major rivers and ending at a bridgehead over the Niederrhein, the Lower Rhine, at a town called Arnhem. If it worked, the corridor would bypass the northern end of the Siegfried Line, the belt of German fortifications along the German border, and place Allied armoured forces in a position to drive southeast into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. The Ruhr produced roughly 70% of Germany's coal, steel and heavy industrial output. Without the Ruhr, the German war machine would, in the estimation of most Allied planners, collapse within months. This is worth holding for a moment. The plan was not a raid, it was not a diversion, it was the plan to end the war in 1944. The operation had 2 components, which is where the name comes from. Market was the airborne component, the seizure of 9 bridges along the corridor by a combined force of American, British and Polish airborne troops, numbering somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 soldiers. Garden was the ground component, the advance of the British Second Army, led by 30th Corps, northward along the corridor over the bridges that Market had seized, with 8 and 12 Corps on the flanks to widen the salient as they moved. The land force was substantial. 10 armoured and motorised brigades, approximately 800 tanks, roughly 50,000 soldiers. They would advance from the south along a single road. A single road, through flat Dutch terrain with soft shoulders on either side that would not support the weight of armoured vehicles, and they had to move 62 miles in roughly 2 days to relieve the paratroopers at Arnhem before those paratroopers ran out of ammunition, food, and men. Here is the key detail that the standard histories tend to understate. The plan worked from south to north. 10th Corps would cross the Belgian border and advance north. The Americans of the 101st Airborne Division, under Major General Maxwell Taylor, would hold the southern section of the corridor, from the Belgian border to Eindhoven. The Americans of the 82nd Airborne Division, under Brigadier General James Gavin, 37 years old, the youngest American general to command a division in combat since the Civil War, would hold the middle section, including the critical crossing over the Vaal River at Nijmegen. And at the far end, 62 miles north, the British 1st Airborne Division, under Major General Roy Urquhart, would seize and hold the bridge at Arnhem until 30th Corps arrived. The timing was the plan. The bridge at Arnhem had to be seized quickly, held against whatever German forces arrived to retake it, and then relieved before those British paratroopers were destroyed. Every hour that 10th Corps was delayed south of Arnhem was an hour the defenders of the Arnhem Bridge got closer to running out of everything. Now meet the man who would become the most important figure in what happened next, not at Arnhem, but in a German command post at Doetinchem. General Wilhelm Bittrich, 50 years old in September of 1944. Born in Wernigerode in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, he had been a fighter pilot in the First World War, then a police officer, then a member of the SS. He commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which, by the conventions of that autumn's fighting, was not really a corps at all. It was 2 battered divisions, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, both of which had suffered heavily in Normandy. But they were there. They were in the Netherlands, resting and refitting, when the sky turned grey with aircraft on the morning of the 17th of September. Bittrich, like Model, understood within minutes what was happening. Unlike the German commanders in Normandy, who had been paralysed by Hitler's orders forbidding them to move their panzer reserves without his permission, Bittrich had the authority and the presence of mind to act immediately. He ordered the Hohenstaufen to move toward Arnhem and the Frundsberg to move toward Nijmegen. He made this decision before he had any intelligence about Allied intentions. He made it on instinct and on the map. It was the right decision. Here is what the Allied planners did not know, and what Model and Bittrich knew very well. The Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg divisions were not combat-ready in the sense that a division at full strength with a full complement of tanks and artillery would be combat-ready. But they were there. They were the only formed armoured forces within striking distance of the Allied corridor. And in the mathematics of Market Garden, where the plan depended on timing measured in hours, the presence of 2 SS Panzer divisions within miles of the landing zones was not a detail. It was the entire story. The intelligence failure that put those 2 divisions in the Netherlands and that put them there at exactly the moment the largest airborne operation in history was descending on their positions has been written about extensively. What has been written about less is the second intelligence failure, the one about the weather. Part 3. What the forecasters knew. The planning for Market Garden took place in the first 2 weeks of September 1944. The weather over northwestern Europe in September is not reliable. It is not the clear, cold weather of winter or the warm stability of summer. It is transitional, fronts moving in from the Atlantic, low-pressure systems tracking across the North Sea, days of solid cloud cover alternating with brief windows of visibility. The airborne planners knew this. They had planned for it. The original Market Garden planning assumed that the airborne lifts, the waves of aircraft bringing men and supplies to the landing zones, would be continuous. The plan called for 3 lifts on the first day. 3 lifts meant enough men on the ground, fast enough to seize and hold all 9 bridges before the Germans could react. The weather cancelled that. On the evening of the 16th of September, the night before the operation began, Allied meteorologists were tracking a front moving in from the Atlantic. The forecast for the 17th was flyable. The operation could go, but the forecast for the 18th and beyond was problematic. Cloud cover, possibly fog, possibly worse. The decision was made to launch on the 17th and hope for the best. This is where the story of what Model feared begins to diverge from the story that is usually told. The standard narrative of Market Garden focuses on the fighting, on the epic stand of the British 1st Airborne at Arnhem, on the American crossing of the Waal at Nijmegen, on XX Corps grinding north along its single road through Dutch villages, while German anti-tank guns fired from the tree lines. These things happened, they are part of the story, but underneath them, shaping them, determining their outcomes, was something that neither side could control and only one side could predict with any reliability: the weather. Consider what the weather meant to each side. For the Allies, clear weather meant aircraft. It meant the supply drops that kept the paratroopers in ammunition and food. It meant the fighter bombers, the Typhoons of the RAF, the Thunderbolts and Mustangs of the American 9th Air Force that could range ahead of XX Corps and destroy German anti-tank positions before they could stop the armoured column. It meant the resupply of the 1st Airborne at Arnhem, which was fighting with the ammunition its men had carried in on their backs and nothing more. Every day of bad weather was a day without resupply. Every day without resupply was a day closer to the end. For Model and the Germans, bad weather meant the opposite. It meant the fighter bombers stayed on the ground. It meant the supply drops didn't come. It meant that the Allied forces on the ground, spread across 62 miles of a narrow corridor, fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, were on their own. It meant time. And time was the one thing Model needed more than anything else. Now meet Lieutenant William Mettler, 24 years old, a meteorological officer attached to the 1st Allied Airborne Army Headquarters at Ascot, England. Born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He had been a junior weather observer with the United States Weather Bureau before the war, working a station in the Allegheny Mountains, where he had learned to read the movement of Atlantic fronts, with the patience of someone who understood that the mountains created their own weather patterns, and that the textbook didn't always apply. Mettler's job in September of 1944 was to produce forecasts for the airborne operations. He was not the chief meteorologist. He was one of several officers working the problem, but he was the one who, in the second week of September, had flagged the concern that the planning staff did not want to hear. The autumn of 1944 was going to be bad. Not uniformly bad, there would be windows, days, or sometimes just hours of flyable weather, but the pattern he was reading in the Atlantic data suggested that those windows would be short, unpredictable, and would not be reliably preceded by enough warning time for large-scale air operations to be planned and executed. He wrote this in a report. The report is in the National Archives. He was right. The weather on the 17th of September was good. The lifts went in, the paratroopers landed, the operation began. Conditions on the 18th were bad. The second lift, carrying thousands of men and critical supplies, was delayed by hours. The British 1st Airborne at Arnhem, which had planned to receive reinforcements on the 18th, did not receive them on schedule. The men holding the north end of the Arnhem Bridge, a small force under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, 40 years old, a professional soldier from Poole in Dorset, who had been a pioneer of British airborne tactics since the early years of the war, held on. But they held on without the reinforcements they had been promised, and every hour they held without reinforcements was an hour the German ring around them tightened. The 19th brought marginally better flying weather. The 20th closed in again with low cloud and rain. That pattern repeated itself throughout the 9 days of the operation. Brief windows of flyable conditions followed by periods of poor visibility that grounded the air forces and stopped the supply drops. And here is the thing that Model understood, sitting in his headquarters reading weather forecasts, that has never quite made it into the popular histories. He was not afraid of the fighter bombers themselves. He had faced fighter bombers on the Eastern Front, in Normandy, across France. He knew what they could do. He knew how to disperse his forces, how to move at night, how to use terrain and tree cover to reduce the damage they could inflict. The fighter bombers were a problem. They were not, by themselves, a solution to a problem that had already been solved. What he feared was the information the weather forecasts represented. The Americans, and here he meant the Allied meteorological apparatus, the network of weather stations and observation aircraft and mathematical models that the Americans had built into a genuine predictive capability by 1944, could see the windows coming. They could not create them, but they could see them. They could plan around them. They could time their operations to the windows in a way that the German side, with its more limited meteorological resources and its more rigid planning structures, could not match. Read that again. Model was not afraid of what the weather did to the battlefield. He was afraid of what the forecasts did to the battle rhythm. The Allied ability to predict the windows meant that every time a window opened, the Allies were ready to exploit it. Every time the weather closed, Model could breathe. But he could never be sure how long he had before the next window opened. The Allies could. And that asymmetry, the difference between knowing and not knowing, between being able to plan and being forced to react, was, in Model's analysis, a form of combat power that had no direct German equivalent. That is the investigation's central claim, and it requires proof. The proof is in the timing. On the 20th of September, the weather over Nijmegen improved. The Allied forecast had predicted this. The 82nd Airborne's assault crossing of the Waal River at Nijmegen, one of the most audacious river crossings of the entire war, conducted in daylight in canvas assault boats against a defended riverbank by men of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was timed to coincide with a window of air support. 26 boats were available. 13 of them were sunk or disabled during the crossing, but the men got across, and when they did, the fighter bombers were there. The Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force came in low over the Nijmegen railway bridge and the road bridge, suppressing the German defenders on the north bank. Model was not surprised by the crossing. He was surprised by the timing. He had expected the weather to give him another day. His meteorological staff had told him the window would not open until the 21st. The Americans had told their commanders it would open on the 20th. The Americans were right. Nijmegen fell on the evening of the 20th. 10 Corps was now within 11 miles of Arnhem, but the weather closed again. And in those 11 miles, in those last miles, in the 24 hours that followed the fall of Nijmegen, the Germans used the closed weather window to move every available unit into the gap between Nijmegen and Arnhem. The Frundsberg Division, elements of the 9th SS Fallschirmjäger units moved up from the south. Anti-tank guns, mortars, infantry dug into the polderland between the two cities. When 10 Corps tried to advance on the 21st, the weather was still closed. No fighter bombers, no air reconnaissance, no supply drops to the 1st Airborne at Arnhem, which by this point had been fighting for 4 days on the ammunition its men had carried in. 11 miles. They never crossed them. The Allied planners who received Mettler's weather forecasts in the days leading up to the 21st had predicted the closure. They had also predicted that it would be brief, 1 day, perhaps 2, before the next window. They were right about the closure. They were right about its duration. What they could not predict was what the Germans would do inside that closed window. And what the Germans did was build a wall. Here is where the forensic reading of Model's command decisions becomes genuinely strange. The records of Army Group B's operations during Market Garden, the daily orders, the movement logs, the unit reports, show a pattern that is not consistent with a commander reacting to Allied moves. They show a commander who was anticipating Allied moves based on weather. Model was scheduling his major defensive preparations for the periods when his meteorological staff told him the weather would be bad. He was scheduling his most aggressive counterattacks, the attempts to cut the corridor south of Arnhem, the attacks on the flanks of 10th Corps, for the periods when the weather was predicted to be poor enough to limit Allied air support. He was reading the same atmosphere the Allied forecasters were reading. He was just reading it with less precision, and that imprecision cost him at Nijmegen. It cost him 24 hours that he could not get back. 24 hours in which the 504th crossed the Waal. The Typhoons came in low, and the bridge fell. If Model had known what Mettler's office knew, if he had known that the window would open on the 20th, not the 21st, he would have reinforced the Nijmegen bridgehead by another 12 hours. The crossing would have faced a different defence. Perhaps the bridge would have held. Perhaps 1010 Corps would never have reached Arnhem at all. That is the counterfactual that Model himself appears to have been calculating in the weeks after the battle from the evidence of his own reports. He wasn't afraid of the fighter bombers, he was afraid of the forecast. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what Market Garden looked like from the German side, not the version that survived in the memoirs of the men who lost, but the version that was being calculated in real time by a commander who understood that he was fighting an information war as much as a ground war, press the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer. And it matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Walter Model won the Battle of Arnhem. He did not win it because his forces were stronger. They were not at the start. He did not win it because Allied planning was poor. The plan was bold and, in several respects, nearly worked. He won it for two reasons, and only one of them appears in most accounts. The first reason is the presence of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Bittrich's two divisions were in the Netherlands by accident. They were there to refit, not to fight, but their presence gave Model a formed armoured force capable of immediate action. Without Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, the British 1st Airborne would have faced the scratch forces that constituted the rest of the German defence in the Netherlands: Kampfgruppen of headquarters troops, Luftwaffe ground crew, rear area security units. Those forces might have been enough to contain the airborne landings, but they would not have been enough to destroy them before 30 Corps arrived. The SS divisions were the difference between containment and destruction. This is well documented. It is in every serious history of the battle. The second reason is almost never stated in these terms. Model understood, with a clarity that his Allied counterparts did not match, that the battle was not 62 miles long. It was 9 days long. And in 9 days of autumn weather over the Netherlands, the question of who could predict the windows of flyable conditions and plan around them was as important as the question of who had more tanks or more men. The Allied meteorological capability in September of 1944 was genuinely superior to Germany's. The network of weather stations, the observation aircraft, the mathematical modelling that the Americans had developed by mid-war gave Allied planners a predictive advantage measured in hours. In a battle where hours were the currency, that advantage was real, but it was not unlimited. The Allied meteorologists could predict the windows. They could not guarantee that what happened inside the windows would be decisive. At Nijmegen, on the 20th of September, the prediction was correct and the exploitation was successful. Between Nijmegen and Arnhem, on the 21st, the prediction was also correct. The window was coming, but the Germans used the preceding closed period to build a defence that the window, when it opened, was not enough to break. That is the cruelty of the battle's mathematics. The Allies had better information. They used it well. It was not enough. Consider the 9 days in sequence. Day 1, the 17th of September. Weather good. First lift successful. 35,000 to 40,000 men on the ground. But the landing zones for the British 1st Airborne were placed too far from the Arnhem Bridge, 6 to 8 miles. A decision made for reasons of ground safety and German anti-aircraft defences. And the German reaction, led by Bittrich, was faster than any Allied plan had accounted for. By the end of the first day, only a small force of roughly 700 men under Frost had reached the north end of the Arnhem Bridge. Day 2, the 18th. Weather bad. Second lift delayed. The 1st Airborne's situation deteriorated. Frost's force at the bridge was surrounded. Day 3, the 19th. Weather marginal. Partial resupply reached some units. Det Corps was still fighting through Eindhoven and Nijmegen, behind schedule. Day 4, the 20th. Weather improved. The Waal crossing succeeded. Nijmegen fell. But 11 miles of open road to Arnhem were now defended by everything Model could scrape together. Day 5, the 21st. Weather bad. Det Corps could not advance. The 1st Airborne at Arnhem was in its 5th day of fighting. Ammunition was nearly gone. The supply drops that came in, when they came in, were landing on drop zones now controlled by the Germans, because the radios that should have guided the aircraft to the correct zones had failed. Days 6 through 9. The pattern repeated. Brief windows, German exploitation of the closed periods, gradual constriction of the 1st Airborne's perimeter. On the 25th of September, the survivors of the 1st Airborne, approximately 2,400 men, out of the roughly 10,000 who had landed, were evacuated across the Niederrhein under the cover of darkness and rain. 2,400 men. The bridge at Arnhem was not taken. Now the biographical epilogue, because these men deserve it. Walter Model was 53 years old when Market Garden ended. He would continue to command Army Group B through the autumn and winter of 1944, through the Ardennes offensive in December, a battle he opposed as strategically futile, and into the spring of 1945. He was encircled in the Ruhr pocket in April of 1945, surrounded by American forces that had finally, 6 months after Market Garden, crossed the Rhine and swept around his position. Faced with the prospect of surrender, he chose not to. On the 21st of April 1945, he walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. He was 53 years old. He is buried in Fossenach in the Hürtgen forest, in a German military cemetery not far from ground he had defended the previous autumn. Wilhelm Bittrich survived the war. He was arrested by the French, tried for war crimes related to atrocities committed by units under his command, convicted and sentenced to imprisonment. He was released in 1953. He died in April of 1979 in Wolfratshausen, Bavaria. He was 80 years old. John Frost, the lieutenant colonel who held the north end of the Arnhem Bridge for 4 days with 700 men against the full weight of the Hohenstaufen division, was wounded and captured on the 21st of September. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He was promoted to general and retired from the British Army in 1968. He died in May of 1993 at the age of 80. The bridge at Arnhem was renamed in his honour. It is called the John Frost Bridge. It is still there. James Gavin, who commanded the 82nd Airborne through the Nijmegen Crossing, went on to serve as a division commander through the rest of the war in Europe. He later became a general and the United States Army's Chief of Research and Development. He died in February of 1990 at the age of 82. And William Mettler, the meteorological officer from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who had written the report that nobody wanted to read, returned to the United States Weather Bureau after the war and spent 30 years forecasting weather over the Allegheny Mountains. There is no bridge named after him. There is no monument. His report is in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in a box with other planning documents for the 1st Allied Airborne Army. It has a reference number. It is available to any researcher who asks for it. The report says what Mettler said it said. The windows will be short. The pattern is not reliable. Plan accordingly. Nobody planned accordingly. Here is what this investigation ultimately finds, and it is not what the standard accounts conclude. The failure of Market Garden is usually attributed to the presence of the SS Panzer divisions, to the distance of the landing zones from the Arnhem Bridge, to the failure of the radios, to the single road, to the ground that could not support armour off the road, to the speed of the German reaction. All of these things are true, all of them contributed, but underneath all of them, shaping the rhythm of every day of the 9-day battle, was the weather. And underneath the weather was the question of who could read it. Model feared the forecasts because he understood what they represented. Not the fighter bombers, he could deal with the fighter bombers. He feared the gap between his meteorological knowledge and theirs. He feared the hours that gap cost him at Nijmegen. He feared that if the gap were any larger, any more consistent, any more reliable, those 11 miles between Nijmegen and Arnhem would have been crossed. They were not crossed. He won. But he knew, and the evidence of his post-battle reports suggests he understood this clearly, that he had won in part because the Allied forecasters, for once, had been almost right, but not quite right enough. The window on the 20th of September had opened when they said it would. The window on the 21st had not stayed closed quite as long as his own staff had told him. He had used the gap between those two predictions to build his defense between Nijmegen and Arnhem. It had been enough. Just enough. Go back to that headquarters east of Arnhem in December. Model is holding a weather forecast. Clear skies. He sets it down. He picks it up. He reads it a third time. He is not reading it to find out when the fighter bombers will come. He is reading it to find out how much time he has. And he is calculating, as he has been calculating since the 17th of September, whether his calculation of the time is as accurate as theirs. He is afraid because he knows it isn't. Clear skies. The Allies will know before he does. They always know before he does. That is what he fears. If this investigation gave you something you didn't have before, a clearer picture of what the battle looked like from inside the German command, from the position of a man who understood that information about the atmosphere was a form of military power, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember this: the most dangerous weapon in any battle is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. Sometimes it is the one that tells you, 12 hours before your enemy knows, when the sky is going to clear. The John Frost Bridge is still standing over the Niederrhein at Arnhem. On clear days, you can see it from a long way off.